The archives of war rarely reveal everything. Between blurred photographs, redacted cables, and sealed testimony, entire histories vanish into silence. Yet fragments remain, whispered between survivors and buried in locked filing cabinets stamped classified. Tonight, 5 of these fragments surface from the deepest shadows of the Second World War, disturbing crimes that were feared, then deliberately forgotten. These are not tales of the battlefield alone. They are stories where governments erased their own sins, where allies silenced allies, and where civilians paid the ultimate price for politics disguised as strategy. As these files unfold, you may feel the unease of recognition, the weight of secrets buried under decades of silence. You may wonder why such crimes were never openly judged, why no memorials rise above their graves, and why entire nations agreed to forget. Listen carefully, for each detail carries the scent of forbidden truth, declassified too late, revealed only in fragments, and perhaps still dangerous to speak aloud. Engage with what you hear. Ask yourself what else lies hidden, unspoken, waiting in the darkness of history's sealed vaults. Chapter 1: The Erased Massacre of Lvov Prisoners. In the summer of 1941, the Eastern Front ignited with a fury unmatched in modern history. On June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was unleashed. As Wehrmacht armored divisions tore across the frontier, entire cities were caught between retreating Soviet forces and advancing German troops. One of those cities was Lvov, then part of eastern Poland, but absorbed into Soviet Ukraine after the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Here, beneath the surface of war, one of the most disturbing and concealed atrocities of the Second World War unfolded. It would later be referred to, in hushed tones and classified files, as the Lvov prison massacres. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, were charged with a grim directive as the Red Army retreated. No prisoners were to be left alive who might serve the Germans. Stalin's paranoia had long targeted the so-called class enemies: intellectuals, political dissidents, priests, members of the Polish elite, and anyone accused of espionage. As German troops pressed toward Lvov, NKVD units received sealed orders coded under Directive No. 2445 SS. Prisoners in Brigidki, Zamostainev, and other detention facilities across the city were marked for liquidation. The killings began between June 22 and June 28, carried out with a cold precision designed to erase identities before the enemy arrived. Eyewitness accounts, later smuggled westward, described the stench of blood and lime-filling prison courtyards. Some inmates were shot point-blank in their cells. Others were strangled with wire or bayoneted in groups when ammunition ran low. Prison files, already bloated with years of interrogations, were scattered and burned in haste. Those who resisted were beaten to death in interrogation chambers, their fingernails ripped away, their bodies discarded in cellars already slick with blood. By the time the NKVD withdrew, thousands lay dead. Conservative estimates suggest more than 7,000 in Lvov alone. When the Wehrmacht entered the city in early July 1941, they found the prisons overflowing with corpses. German war photographers, attached to the 1st Mountain Division, documented the decomposing remains, many bound, gagged, or mutilated beyond recognition. These images were soon used in propaganda reels, paraded as proof of Bolshevik barbarism. Yet beneath the staged Nazi spectacle lay a horrifying reality. Civilians who were permitted to enter the prisons recalled stepping over heaps of bodies, with walls stained black from gunfire and viscera. Some victims were discovered in kneeling positions, hands still tied, their last moments frozen in silence. The city reeked of decay, the flies thick in the summer heat. These memories, once spoken in whispers, were silenced by competing regimes of propaganda. Western intelligence services quickly became aware of the atrocity. Reports were filed from Polish underground couriers who reached London, carrying testimonies of relatives searching for the missing. British intelligence, operating through the Special Operations Executive, collected statements but locked them into files marked most secret. The Americans, already monitoring Soviet activities through the OSS, cross-referenced these reports with decrypted cables from Moscow. The evidence was undeniable. Yet neither Washington nor London dared to speak publicly. The Soviet Union was not only a military ally against Hitler, but also an essential partner whose morale could not be shattered by accusations of mass murder. Silence became the chosen strategy. The tragedy of Lvov was compounded by the way it was exploited. Nazi officials staged tours of the prisons, inviting journalists from Axis countries to photograph the carnage. They emphasized the role of Jewish Bolsheviks, deliberately distorting the truth to fuel anti-Semitic propaganda and justify the Holocaust. Meanwhile, survivors who had lost loved ones were caught in the impossible crossfire of narratives. The Soviets denied responsibility, blaming German provocations, while the Germans twisted the massacre into their own campaign of hate. The actual victims, the executed prisoners, were rendered voiceless twice, first by murder and then by propaganda. Buried within Soviet archives, the official records of the Lvov killings were marked Delo num 12487, Confidencialno. These files remained sealed throughout the Cold War, inaccessible even to historians within the USSR. When Khrushchev later attempted to distance his leadership from Stalin's legacy, the subject was deliberately omitted. To acknowledge the massacre would have been to confirm that the Soviet state had butchered its own people, and more importantly, to admit that allies during the Great Patriotic War had concealed knowledge of the crime. This was deemed unacceptable in a system where history was carefully engineered to maintain unity and legitimacy. Accounts from survivors slowly leaked into émigré communities. Polish exiles in London, and later Chicago and Toronto, published testimonies in underground journals. They described loved ones vanishing after routine arrests in 1940 and 1941, only to be identified later in photographs of prison courtyards filled with corpses. A few German photographs survived the destruction of Berlin in 1945, tucked into archives or smuggled by soldiers. These became chilling evidence decades later, when historians pieced together the atrocity. But the silence endured. At Nuremberg, where Nazi war crimes were catalogued in exhausting detail, there was no mention of Lvov. To preserve the fragile alliance with Moscow, prosecutors avoided raising the subject. The massacre, like the Katyn forest killings, remained in the shadows. The most haunting element of the Lvov prison killings is how ordinary families were erased. Teachers, priests, civil servants, and farmers, all swept into the NKVD's machinery of suspicion, were executed without trial. Lists of names, handwritten in Cyrillic script, sometimes surfaced in stray files. Most, however, vanished into ash when archives were torched during the retreat. Mothers searched for sons who never returned. Wives clutched scraps of identification cards recovered from lime pits. Children grew up with whispered stories of fathers taken at night, their fate unacknowledged by both East and West. These silences became generational scars, unspoken but deeply felt. The Cold War ensured the massacre remained buried. In the United States, congressional hearings into Soviet crimes occasionally mentioned mass executions in eastern Poland, but without naming Lvov directly. In Britain, references were softened into civilian casualties during the Soviet withdrawal. Only in the late 20th century, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, did archives in Kiev and Moscow reluctantly open. Researchers uncovered fragmentary NKVD reports describing completed liquidation of counter-revolutionary elements, written in chilling bureaucratic language. The numbers aligned with long-whispered survivor estimates. Thousands murdered in less than a week. Today, the memory of Lvov lingers in uneasy silence. Memorials stand in parts of Ukraine, but often overshadowed by larger narratives of war and occupation. The massacre remains less known than Katyn, less documented than Babi Yar, yet no less horrifying. It is a story erased not only by Stalin's orders, but also by the complicity of Allied silence. For every declassified cable, there are still sealed boxes marked sensitive, containing testimonies too fragile for public release. And for every victim identified, countless remain unnamed, buried in forgotten courtyards and unmarked graves beneath the modern city. The erased massacre of Lvov prisoners reveals the darkest truth of wartime politics, that some crimes were not merely hidden by their perpetrators, but deliberately ignored by those who should have exposed them. It was a decision made in war rooms and embassies, where alliances mattered more than justice, and where silence condemned the innocent to permanent oblivion. In peeling back the secrecy, we glimpsed not only the horror of one city in 1941, but the larger machinery of denial that shaped the 20th century. This is why the massacre remains disturbing even today, not only for the blood spilled, but for the silence that followed, long after the bodies were left to rot in the cells of Lvov. Chapter 2. Classified experiments of Unit 731 exposed. In the icy expanse of northeastern China, near the city of Harbin, the Japanese Kwantung Army constructed a facility that became synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. Known officially as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, it carried the seemingly innocuous codename of Unit 731. To its victims, however, it was a place of death, dissection, and unimaginable suffering. Hidden under the guise of scientific progress, the facility became the epicenter of Japan's biological warfare program. Thousands of men, women, and children, civilians and prisoners of war alike, were reduced to test subjects, or as the researchers chillingly called them, maruta, meaning logs. The roots of Unit 731 stretch back to the 1930s, when Japan sought to dominate Asia under its imperial expansion. Following the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Japanese military strategists looked for ways to gain supremacy not only through conventional weapons, but also through biological warfare. General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless army physician, emerged as the architect of this program. Ishii persuaded his superiors that diseases could be weaponized as effectively as artillery and with less expense. In 1936, construction began on the sprawling compound at Pingfang. It would soon house laboratories, crematoria, pressure chambers, and underground facilities hidden from aerial reconnaissance. Official Japanese documents described it as a research station for water purification. In reality, it became one of the most secretive death factories of the Second World War. Inside Unit 731, experiments pushed the boundaries of human endurance and morality. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera. Some were injected with venereal diseases to study transmission. Frostbite experiments were among the most infamous. Test subjects were left exposed to sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze solid, then thawed with hot water or struck with blunt instruments to measure the shattering of tissue. Survivors, if any, were dissected alive without anesthesia. The corpses were discarded in furnaces or buried in shallow graves outside the compound. Estimates suggest that over 10,000 people perished directly in Unit 731, though the true figure may be far higher when accounting for field tests conducted across China. The experiments were not confined to the laboratory. Japanese forces released plague-infested fleas from ceramic bombs over Chinese villages, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands. Cholera and typhoid bacteria were poured into rivers and wells, contaminating food supplies for entire regions. Military reports coded as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night even detailed plans to release plague-carrying insects over San Diego in 1945. Though Japan's surrender prevented its execution, each of these operations was catalogued in secret field manuals, stamped with the seal of the Kwantung Army. These documents would later vanish into the classified vaults of another power, the United States. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Unit 731's officers scrambled to destroy evidence. Laboratories were dismantled, buildings blown up, and surviving prisoners executed to silence testimony. Yet many records and much of the scientific data survived, carefully guarded by Ishii and his colleagues. As American forces advanced into occupied Japan, they quickly became aware of the existence of this biological program. US military intelligence, working under General Douglas MacArthur, recognized the strategic value of Ishii's research. Instead of prosecuting him and his staff for war crimes, as had been done with Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, American officials struck a secret deal. In exchange for full disclosure of their data on human experimentation and biological warfare, Ishii and his scientists were granted immunity. This decision was codified in confidential memoranda between the US Army's Chemical Corps and MacArthur's Tokyo headquarters. Reports were filed under classifications such as Top Secret, Far East Command, File 331. These documents reveal that American officials considered the experiments absolutely invaluable for advancing their own biological warfare capabilities during the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union, already expanding its influence across Eastern Europe and Asia, was perceived as a looming threat. Any advantage, even one built on the corpses of Unit 731's victims, was deemed acceptable. Thus, the atrocities were not merely forgotten. They were deliberately concealed, integrated into the classified research archives of the United States. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union conducted its own investigation. In 1949, during the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, captured Japanese officers testified in detail about the experiments at Unit 731. They described human dissections, plague bombs, and deliberate contamination of civilian populations. Transcripts of the trials, running hundreds of pages, were published internationally. Yet the West dismissed them as propaganda, claiming the Soviets fabricated the evidence for political gain. Only decades later, when survivors and declassified documents surfaced, did the scale of the crimes become undeniable. The victims, however, had long since been forgotten in the pursuit of geopolitical advantage. For those who survived, the memories of Pingfang were scars that never faded. One former Chinese prisoner, smuggled out before the facility was demolished, recalled hearing screams every night, screams cut short by gunfire or sudden silence. Families who lived near the compound spoke of smoke rising constantly from its chimneys, carrying the acrid smell of burning flesh. Farmers were warned never to approach certain fields, as they had been seeded with disease for testing. These whispers persisted long after the war, though they were rarely believed by outsiders. The Japanese government itself maintained silence for decades, refusing to acknowledge the existence of Unit 731 until overwhelming evidence forced partial admissions. In the 1990s, the secrecy surrounding Unit 731 raises one of the most haunting questions of the Second World War. How many scientific breakthroughs in modern warfare and medicine trace their origins to these atrocities? American researchers in Fort Detrick, Maryland, the center of US biological warfare research, quietly incorporated Ishii's findings into their own programs. Files declassified in the 1980s revealed that data from frostbite experiments influenced military survival training. Other reports suggested that methods for mass production of plague fleas were studied for possible deployment during the Korean War. The victims, stripped of dignity and life, were erased even in death, their suffering transformed into footnotes in classified research reports. Unit 731 also highlights the moral compromises made in the name of national security. By granting immunity to war criminals, the US established a precedent where justice could be traded for advantage. Unlike the Nazi doctors executed after the Nuremberg doctors' trial, Ishii lived out his days in relative peace, dying of throat cancer in 1959. Many of his colleagues assumed prestigious positions in post-war Japan, some becoming professors, others leading pharmaceutical companies. Their pasts were buried under layers of silence, while the families of their victims remained voiceless, denied both recognition and justice. Even today, the full scale of Unit 731's crimes remains obscured. Chinese villages contaminated during experiments still report mass graves unearthed accidentally during construction. Former soldiers confess in late-life memoirs about releasing plague bombs or witnessing dissections. Yet many archives remain sealed, both in Tokyo and Washington, under the justification of national security. What emerges is only fragments, enough to horrify, but never enough to complete the picture. This is the enduring legacy of Unit 731, a crime so vast and disturbing that it was not merely hidden, but actively protected by those who stood to benefit. The story of Unit 731 is not just about what happened in a remote corner of Manchuria. It is about the decisions made in air-conditioned offices in Washington, Tokyo, and Moscow, decisions that valued information over justice and secrecy over truth. It reveals the willingness of powerful nations to suppress crimes when they serve strategic goals, leaving victims to vanish from the record. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the Second World War did not end with unconditional justice, but with bargains, silences, and forgotten graves. As the classified experiments of Unit 731 come into sharper focus through survivor testimony and reluctant admissions, the horror grows more profound. For every detail revealed, there are countless more sealed in vaults, still considered too dangerous for the public. The victims remain nameless in most records, remembered only as logs in the cruel language of their tormentors. Their suffering reminds us that the greatest atrocities are not always the ones shouted from rooftops, but the ones buried in silence, hidden under the stamp of top secret, waiting to resurface decades later with a chilling reminder of what human beings are capable of when morality is sacrificed to power. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Pact of Katyn Forest. Spring in Eastern Europe carries with it the smell of thawing earth. In 1940, that thaw revealed something far darker beneath the forests near Smolensk. The Katyn massacre, long denied, long buried, remains one of the most chilling examples of state-sanctioned murder during the Second World War. For decades, it was not only the Soviets who suppressed the truth, but also their allies, who weighed justice against politics and chose silence. The events that unfolded in the Katyn forest and the subsequent cover-up tell a story of betrayal, secrecy, and the deliberate erasure of thousands of lives. The origins lie in September 1939, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. With Poland carved up between Hitler and Stalin, hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner. The Soviet NKVD, under the ruthless command of Lavrenti Beria, segregated the officers, intellectuals, and elites. They were sent to camps in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. These men represented Poland's leadership class: military officers, judges, professors, priests, engineers, and politicians. They were the backbone of a nation, and for Stalin, they were also a threat. In March 1940, Beria sent a classified memorandum to Stalin. The document, marked top secret and labeled file number 794-B, recommended the execution of over 22,000 Polish prisoners. The justification was chillingly bureaucratic. These men were hardened, incorrigible enemies of Soviet authority. Stalin approved the proposal without hesitation. Over the following weeks, the prisoners were methodically transported to execution sites. At Katyn Forest, near Smolensk, the victims were bound, gagged, and shot in the back of the head with German-made Walther pistols, an attempt to confuse future investigators. The bodies were dumped in mass graves, layered in rows, each covered with soil, before the next group arrived. The process was efficient, industrial, and merciless. For 3 years, the truth lay hidden beneath the soil. Families in occupied Poland received no news of their loved ones. Letters stopped arriving from the camps. The Polish government in exile in London made repeated inquiries, but Moscow offered vague assurances, claiming the men had been moved. It was not until 1943, when the German army advanced into the Smolensk region, that the graves were uncovered. Local villagers, who had heard gunfire at night years earlier, guided German investigators to the site. What they uncovered horrified even hardened soldiers. Thousands of corpses in neat layers, each wearing Polish military uniforms, many still clutching rosaries, diaries, or identification papers. The Germans seized the opportunity to exploit the discovery. They invited international observers, including Red Cross officials and journalists from neutral countries, to witness the exhumations. Photographs and films were distributed as propaganda, highlighting Soviet barbarism. Yet even as Berlin sought to use Katyn to divide the Allies, the evidence was undeniable. The victims had been killed in the spring of 1940, when the region was firmly under Soviet control. Documents, letters, and personal belongings all pointed to the NKVD. Still, Stalin denied everything. Moscow insisted the massacre had been committed by the Germans in 1941, after they captured Smolensk. Soviet reports, prepared under the watchful eye of propaganda minister Andrei Zhdanov, fabricated evidence to support the claim. The Polish government in exile demanded answers. In April 1943, they appealed to the International Red Cross to investigate independently. Stalin's response was furious. He accused the Poles of collaborating with Hitler and severed diplomatic ties with the government in exile. This maneuver silenced further official inquiries, isolating Poland and tightening Soviet control over its post-war fate. Meanwhile, in London and Washington, intelligence officers reviewed classified cables and decrypted Soviet messages. They knew the truth. British intelligence reports, marked most secret for Prime Minister's eyes only, concluded the massacre was committed by the Soviets. American diplomats, including Ambassador Averell Harriman, sent detailed memoranda warning of Stalin's guilt. But the political calculus of wartime alliance prevailed. Roosevelt and Churchill both chose silence. Exposing Stalin risked shattering the coalition needed to defeat Hitler, and so, the truth was buried, along with the bodies. At Nuremberg, when Nazi crimes were exposed in exhaustive detail, Katyn was conspicuously absent. The Soviets attempted to charge Germany with the massacre, presenting falsified evidence and coerced testimonies. But even among the prosecutors, doubts lingered. American and British lawyers, bound by the need to maintain unity, avoided pressing the issue. Ultimately, Katyn was left unresolved in the trial records, another casualty of Cold War politics. The murdered officers, their families still searching for closure, remained unacknowledged victims. For the survivors, silence was a wound that never healed. Wives and children of the murdered officers lived in exile, their grief compounded by official denial. They whispered stories at kitchen tables, clutched photographs of fathers and brothers, and gathered in churches to pray for men whose names could not be publicly spoken. In Soviet-occupied Poland, even mentioning Katyn was dangerous. Teachers risked imprisonment for raising the subject. Families who dared to commemorate their dead were watched by the secret police. The massacre was not just a physical extermination, but an erasure from memory, enforced by censorship and fear. The truth began to surface in fragments during the Cold War. In 1951, the US Congress established the Madden Committee to investigate Katyn. After interviewing witnesses and reviewing documents, the committee concluded unequivocally that the Soviets were responsible. Yet the findings were kept out of official diplomacy, filed away as part of the Cold War's arsenal of propaganda. In the Soviet Union, the denial continued. Official encyclopedias listed Katyn as a German atrocity. Textbooks repeated the lie. It was not until 1990, under the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, that Moscow finally admitted the NKVD's responsibility. Even then, full accountability was elusive. Many files remain classified, and the Russian government continues to resist full disclosure. The mechanics of the massacre reveal the chilling efficiency of state violence. Survivors of nearby villages describe trucks arriving at night, the sound of gunshots echoing through the trees, and the heavy rumble of earth being moved. Some claim they smelled blood and decay for weeks after. The executioners, members of the NKVD's 1st Special Division, worked in shifts to manage the killing. Pistols were chosen deliberately to minimize noise and conserve ammunition. Records indicate that the Soviets imported German ammunition to muddy the forensic trail. The bodies were arranged in layers, face down, with their hands bound behind their backs. When exhumed, many were found with documents still dated from April 1940, proof of the execution timeline. For historians, Katyn remains a symbol of both atrocity and denial. The massacre was not unique in scale. Other massacres during the war claimed more lives, but it stands out for the decades of deliberate suppression. It reveals how the politics of alliance and the necessities of war can obscure even the most blatant crimes. It demonstrates how truth can be twisted, documents falsified, and victims erased, all in the service of geopolitical necessity. And it leaves haunting questions about the moral cost of silence. Today, memorials stand in Katyn Forest, in Warsaw, and in other cities around the world. Lists of the murdered officers are carved into stone, their names restored after half a century of erasure. Yet the politics of memory remain fraught. In Russia, official recognition waxes and wanes with the tides of nationalism. Some leaders acknowledge the crime, others retreat to old narratives of German guilt, the documents that could fully resolve unanswered questions. Who gave the exact orders, how the logistics were managed, how many truly died, remain sealed in Russian archives, marked with the same red stamps that once consigned them to secrecy. The forbidden Pact of Katyn Forest is not just the story of a massacre. It is the story of how nations can conspire to forget, how truth can be delayed by decades, and how justice can be sacrificed for diplomacy. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the Allied victory in 1945 was not only a triumph of freedom, but also a tapestry woven with silences, compromises, and unacknowledged crimes. For the victims of Katyn, the silence was as heavy as the soil that covered their graves. And for us, their story serves as a warning that history is not only written by the victors, but also edited by their convenience. Chapter 4: Hidden Horrors of the Nemmersdorf Massacre. October 1944. The Eastern Front had become a storm of fire and steel. The Red Army, strengthened by its victories at Kursk and Operation Bagration, pressed relentlessly westward. As German defenses crumbled, the Soviet advance spilled into East Prussia, ancestral German territory. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, foreign troops crossed into German soil. What followed in the small East Prussian village of Nemmersdorf became one of the most disturbing and suppressed atrocities of the war, both exploited for propaganda and later erased from official memory. The massacre at Nemmersdorf stands as a grim reminder of what happens when vengeance and silence collide. Nemmersdorf was a quiet farming settlement near the Angarap River, its population largely elderly, women and children. Most able-bodied men were already conscripted into the Wehrmacht or Volkssturm. On October 21, 1944, units of the Soviet 11th Guards Army, part of the Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, forced their way into the village. The German military had recently fortified the area with defensive lines, but Soviet artillery reduced them to rubble. When the Red Army crossed the Angarat Bridge, what awaited the villagers was not liberation but terror. Survivor testimonies, collected later by German authorities and local civilians, describe scenes of unimaginable brutality. Women of all ages were subjected to mass sexual violence, often in front of their families. Elderly residents and children were not spared. Some victims were nailed to barn doors, crucified with their arms spread wide. Others were found with their skulls smashed, their bodies mutilated. The brutality extended to livestock, with animals slaughtered senselessly and property destroyed in a frenzy of revenge. The chaos bore no resemblance to military necessity. It was an eruption of pent-up hatred, inflamed by years of Nazi atrocities in Soviet lands. When Wehrmacht forces retook Nemmersdorf 2 days later, they discovered a nightmare. Soldiers of the Grossdeutschland division entered barns and cottages to find corpses of women and girls, stripped and violated, sprawled across straw beds. Children lay in cribs with broken skulls. A village once marked by quiet farm life now reeked of blood and decay. The German High Command immediately dispatched photographers and correspondents from Die Deutsche Wochenschau, the Nazi propaganda newsreel, to capture the evidence. The images, burned homes, desecrated bodies, and mass graves, were circulated widely, intended to stiffen German resistance and instill fear of Soviet occupation. Pamphlets carried slogans like, "The Bolsheviks are coming for your wives and children." For many German civilians, Nemmersdorf became a symbol of impending annihilation, fueling the desperate will to fight in the collapsing Reich. Yet the truth of Nemmersdorf is layered with ambiguity. While there is little doubt atrocities occurred, historians later wrestled with the reliability of some German reports. The Nazi regime had a vested interest in amplifying Soviet brutality to rally the home front. Some photographs may have been staged and the number of victims exaggerated, but even Allied intelligence documents, kept classified during the war, acknowledged Soviet crimes against civilians in East Prussia. Reports from British officers, later declassified, noted that excesses occurred, which could not be excused by the demands of war. American diplomats described horrors beyond imagination in confidential cables. Yet publicly, the Allies remained silent. To admit such crimes would have damaged the carefully maintained alliance with Stalin. The Soviets, for their part, denied everything. Official communiqué dismissed Nemmersdorf as a German fabrication, a fascist provocation. For decades, Soviet historians maintained that the Red Army liberated East Prussia honorably, portraying their soldiers as avengers of Nazi crimes. Testimonies of refugees were suppressed, dismissed as Nazi sympathizers or collaborators. Even after the war, East Prussian civilians who tried to recount what they saw were often silenced, especially in East Germany, where Soviet occupation authorities enforced censorship. The massacre became a forbidden subject, whispered only in private among survivors and émigrés in the West. The geopolitical context explains the silence. By late 1944, the Allied powers were preparing for Yalta and the division of Europe. Stalin's cooperation was essential. No Western leader wished to antagonize Moscow with accusations of war crimes. Just as with Katyn, evidence of Soviet atrocities was deliberately ignored. For German civilians, however, the fear of Nemmersdorf became visceral reality. As the Red Army swept through Silesia, Pomerania, and eventually into Berlin, millions fled westward, driven by terror of what had happened in that East Prussian village. The Nemmersdorf massacre was not unique. It was a harbinger. Across East Prussia, Pomerania, and East Prussia, accounts of sexual violence, mass killings, and looting multiplied. Soviet soldiers, brutalized by years of German invasion and propaganda, sought revenge with impunity. Commanders often turned a blind eye, prioritizing the momentum of the offensive over discipline. In some cases, officers themselves participated. Diaries recovered from Soviet troops reveal casual mentions of plunder and rape, written with chilling detachment. One Red Army soldier noted, "We have come to Germany, now they will pay." For decades after 1945, Nemmersdorf remained politically untouchable. In West Germany, survivors published memoirs, but these were often dismissed as tainted by Nazi propaganda. In East Germany, silence was enforced by Soviet censors. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, that scholars began to revisit the evidence with a critical eye. Archival documents, military reports, and forensic studies confirm that atrocities had occurred, though perhaps on a smaller scale than Nazi propaganda had claimed. Still, the core truth remained: civilians were massacred, women were raped, and the village was destroyed. The enduring horror of Nemmersdorf lies not only in the crimes themselves, but in their use and abuse. The Nazis exploited the massacre for propaganda, twisting truth to serve their ends. The Soviets denied it outright, burying the voices of victims beneath layers of censorship. The Allies, prioritizing politics, chose silence. In every case, the truth was sacrificed, leaving survivors in a void of disbelief and denial. For the villagers who lived through that October, the wounds never healed. Families scattered, homes destroyed, and the memory of unspeakable violence hung over them like a shadow that could not be named. Today, Nemmersdorf is known as Mayakovskoye, part of Russia's Kaliningrad Oblast. Few physical traces remain of the massacre. The fields have been repopulated, the barns rebuilt, and the land folded into new political borders. Yet memory persists in testimonies, photographs, and declassified files. The story of Nemmersdorf forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that victors too committed crimes, and that those crimes were hidden, denied, or manipulated depending on political need. It challenges the narrative of the liberating army, exposing the darker side of vengeance unleashed in war's final stages. The hidden horrors of the Nemmersdorf massacre remind us that crimes are not confined to one side, nor are they always acknowledged. They exist in the grey zones of memory, where propaganda distorts, politics silences, and survivors struggle to be heard. In the silence that followed, the victims of Nemmersdorf became both symbols and ghosts, used to terrify, denied by their killers, and forgotten by those who needed to maintain alliances. Their story lingers, unresolved, in the shadows of history, where truth and silence intertwine. Chapter 5. The disturbing silence of Operation Keelhaul. The guns of Europe had fallen silent by May 1945. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and nations staggered under the weight of devastation. Yet in the chaotic aftermath of victory, one of the most disturbing and least remembered crimes of the Second World War unfolded, not in secret prisons or on battlefields, but in the open fields and camps where desperate refugees huddled. It bore the name Operation Keelhaul, a phrase that to this day is cloaked in secrecy and moral unease. Behind the bland terminology of post-war agreements, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were condemned to death or gulags, not by their enemies, but by the very allies they had trusted to protect them. The roots of Operation Keelhaul lie in the Yalta Conference of February 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, meeting in the Crimean resort, agreed on the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens who found themselves in Western-controlled zones. For Stalin, this was non-negotiable. He regarded anyone who had fled, surrendered, or collaborated with the Germans as traitors deserving of punishment. For Churchill and Roosevelt, the issue was framed as a matter of alliance unity. In secret clauses and classified memoranda, Western leaders consented to Stalin's demands. The decision would later consign tens of thousands to execution, imprisonment, or exile in Siberian labor camps. The victims came from diverse backgrounds. Among them were Cossacks who had fought against the Soviets, white Russian émigrés who had fled the revolution decades earlier, and civilians who had been deported westward as forced laborers. Many were not Soviet citizens at all: Poles, Yugoslavs, and others caught in the tides of shifting borders. In Austria and northern Italy, where many refugees had gathered at the end of the war, Allied soldiers rounded them up under orders marked Most Secret Operation Keelhaul. Families were told they would be transported to safety, only to find themselves handed over to NKVD officers waiting at border checkpoints. Eyewitness accounts paint scenes of desperation and betrayal. At the camp near Lienz, Austria, British soldiers surrounded Cossack refugees who believed they were being resettled. Officers invited community leaders to a conference, only to arrest them and deliver them to the Soviets. When the deception became clear, chaos erupted. Refugees clung to British trucks. Mothers held their children aloft, begging for mercy, and some chose suicide rather than return to Stalin's grasp. Diaries recovered later describe men slitting their throats with hidden blades, families throwing themselves into rivers, and priests leading final prayers before forced handovers. Yet the soldiers, many themselves appalled, followed orders. Reports indicate that some British units wept as they loaded crying children onto Soviet-bound trains, but disobedience risked court-martial. In Italy, similar scenes unfolded. Yugoslav refugees who had fled Tito's communist forces were rounded up by Allied units and delivered to their executioners. Many were taken to isolated fields, executed en masse, and buried in unmarked pits. Others were herded into cattle cars bound for labor camps deep within the Soviet Union. A chilling pattern emerged. Western officers knew the likely fate of these people, but their instructions were explicit. Documents uncovered decades later reveal orders from British Foreign Office officials urging strict compliance with repatriation agreements and warning against sympathetic delays. It was, in essence, bureaucracy carrying out mass betrayal. The moral weight of Operation Keelhaul lay in the awareness of its consequences. Allied commanders were not ignorant of Stalin's methods. Reports from liberated Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine had already revealed the NKVD's ruthlessness. Yet Western governments justified their actions as obligations under international agreements. Classified cables between Washington and London acknowledged the likelihood of executions, but dismissed them as internal Soviet affairs. In private, Churchill referred to the matter as a bloody business, but he never challenged the policy. For Roosevelt, whose health was failing, the priority was maintaining Soviet participation in the war against Japan. Human lives were the currency of alliance politics. The operation remained hidden from public knowledge for decades. Soldiers who participated were sworn to secrecy, their reports stamped with red seals and buried in military archives. Survivors who managed to escape spoke of betrayal, but their voices were drowned in the politics of the Cold War. Western governments denied knowledge, while the Soviets never admitted to the scope of executions and deportations. The term Operation Keelhaul itself only surfaced in the 1970s, when British historian Nikolai Tolstoy uncovered declassified documents and survivor testimonies. His research revealed the staggering scale of the repatriations, hundreds of thousands across Europe, and the chilling efficiency with which they were carried out. Among the most haunting revelations were the fates of the Cossack officers delivered at Lienz. Many were executed within days of their return. Others were sent to gulags in Siberia, where they perished from starvation, cold, or overwork. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, their identities erased. In Yugoslavia, Tito's forces carried out mass killings of repatriated refugees, dumping their bodies into karst pits and caves. The silence surrounding these atrocities was enforced not only by Soviet secrecy, but by Western reluctance to admit complicity. For decades, the official record remained blank, as though these people had never existed. Operation Keelhaul reveals the uncomfortable truth about the post-war order: that justice was not universal, and victory did not mean freedom for all. While Nazi leaders were tried and executed at Nuremberg, countless victims of Stalin's revenge were delivered to their deaths by the same allies who championed democracy and human rights. It was a moral compromise made in the name of geopolitics, hidden from public view, because it contradicted the triumphant narrative of liberation. In the words of one declassified British cable, the matter is best forgotten. Forgotten it nearly was. Survivors who rebuilt their lives in exile carried the memory in silence, passing it down only within families. Some refused to speak, haunted by guilt at having survived when others did not. Others spoke too loudly and were dismissed as liars or Nazi sympathizers. The lack of recognition compounded their trauma. To lose one's home is tragedy enough. To be betrayed by supposed liberators is an injustice that corrodes the soul. Even today, the names of many victims remain unrecorded, their graves unmarked, their stories absent from history books. The disturbing silence of Operation Keelhaul lingers not only in what was done, but in what was hidden. It demonstrates how governments can collude to erase their own crimes, how archives can bury truths for generations, and how victims can be consigned to oblivion in the name of politics. The operation was not an accident of war, nor an isolated excess. It was deliberate policy, executed with precision, documented in files still marked restricted. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, the price of alliances, and the value of human life when weighed against strategy. As the Cold War deepened, the story of Operation Keelhaul remained dangerous. To acknowledge it would have undermined Western moral authority, exposing hypocrisy at the heart of the free world. It was safer to let it fade, to allow victims to vanish into obscurity, their cries lost to time. Only in recent decades, with the opening of archives and the testimonies of survivors, has the scale of the operation come to light. Yet even now, official apologies are rare and recognition incomplete. The silence that followed Operation Keelhaul may be its most disturbing legacy. Silence from governments that betrayed their own principles. Silence from historians who hesitated to confront the complicity of democratic nations. Silence from a world eager to celebrate victory without acknowledging the cost paid by the voiceless. And in that silence, the victims remain. Ghosts of a war that did not end for them in 1945, but in the gulags, the execution pits, and the nameless fields where they were abandoned by history. History is never as clean as victory parades and official speeches suggest. Behind the photographs of flags raised over ruined capitals and the declarations of peace signed in grand halls, there exists another record, one written in secrecy, denial, and silence. The files we have examined tonight reveal that the Second World War did not end in triumph for everyone. For many, liberation meant betrayal, justice meant erasure, and survival meant carrying memories too dangerous to speak aloud. These crimes, feared and forgotten, force us to confront the darker truths buried beneath the narrative of good war and just victory. What else lies hidden in sealed archives, waiting to be uncovered? How many more names, villages, and families were consumed by silence because governments decided their stories were inconvenient? If these 5 chapters have surfaced only now, after decades of suppression, imagine what remains sealed behind locked doors and redacted pages. Do we dare to keep digging? Do we dare to speak of what was meant to be erased? The vault of history is vast, and its shadows remain deep. Perhaps the question is not whether we will uncover more, but whether we are ready to face what we might find.